On the morning of July 21, 1972, a federal agency in Washington, D.C. quietly released a 143-page technical report. And almost nobody noticed, because the car it was about had already been dead for 3 years. The last one had rolled off the line at Willow Run in Ypsilanti, Michigan, on May 14, 1969, photographed by reporters the way you'd photograph a coffin. That report had a plain, bureaucratic title: Evaluation of 1960 to 63, Corvair Handling and Stability. And inside it, after 2 years of investigation, after tearing through General Motors' internal memos, after reviewing national accident data, after strapping outriggers onto a 1963 Corvair and throwing it around a Texas proving ground next to a Ford Falcon, a Plymouth Valiant, a Volkswagen Beetle, and a Renault Dauphine, the United States government concluded that the most notorious car in American history, the car whose name had become a synonym for death trap, the car that had launched the entire American consumer movement, the car that a young lawyer named Ralph Nader had made famous by calling it unsafe at any speed, was, in extreme handling conditions, no more likely to lose control than the perfectly ordinary compacts parked all around it. So here is the question that should bother you. If the Corvair passed, if a panel of 3 independent automotive experts reviewed that investigation and signed off that the car had no safety defect, then why does every single person who has heard of this car still know exactly one thing about it? That it killed people? Why did the Exoneration change nothing? Because the real story of the Corvair is not a story about a car at all. And the moment you understand what it's actually about, you will never look at a product, recall, a viral scandal, or a corporate apology the same way again. Start in 1959. Chevrolet's chief engineer Ed Cole is about to do something no Detroit executive in his right mind would do: build an American car with the engine in the back. Not a fringe experiment. A mass-market family car. The Corvair arrives for the 1960 model year with an air-cooled flat 6 hanging out behind the rear axle, 4-wheel independent suspension, no radiator, no drive shaft hump running down the middle of the floor, and a flat, low, elegant body that European designers would spend the next decade quietly copying. It is, by an enormous margin, the most technically adventurous car Detroit has ever mass-produced. And in 1960, nobody is calling it dangerous. They're calling it brilliant. Over 10 model years, Chevrolet will build roughly 8 million of them. But there are 2 numbers stamped on that car. 2 ordinary numbers printed on a sticker most owners never read. And those 2 numbers are going to end up costing General Motors its reputation, costing an American president a signature, and rewriting the relationship between every consumer and every corporation in the country. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it. Because first, something unexpected happens. Chevrolet built the Corvair to fight the Volkswagen Beetle, a sensible, thrifty, 4-door economy car for people who didn't want a land yacht. That version sells fine. But then, almost as an afterthought, Chevrolet drops in bucket seats, a nicer interior, a 4-speed, and calls it the Monza. And America loses its mind. The Monza doesn't sell like an economy car. It sells like a sports car to young buyers who don't care about fuel economy and care enormously about looking good in a parking lot. By 1963, our featured car, the Corvair Monza Club Coupe, is the version everybody wants. Rear-engined, sharp-edged, cheap enough for a first job, quick enough to embarrass a Beetle, and light on its feet in a way that no American car had ever been. It accidentally invents the affordable sporty compact, and Ford will notice, and that will matter more than anything Ralph Nader ever wrote. But a car that feels magical at 7/10 can behave very differently at 10/10. And the Corvair had a hard limit that most of its owners were never told about. Here is the engineering, in plain English. The 1960-63 Corvair used a swing-axle rear suspension. Each rear wheel bolted to a half shaft that pivoted from a single joint at the differential, so the wheel didn't just move up and down, it swung through an arc, changing its angle to the road as it did. Push hard enough in a corner, and lateral force could effectively lift the rear of the car, tilting those wheels onto their inside edges, a phenomenon engineers call jacking, ending in tuck under. When it happens, the rear tires lose their grip in a hurry. The tail comes around, and the car spins. And because the engine sat behind the rear axle, with roughly 40% of the weight on the nose and 60% on the tail, the effect was amplified. You had the heaviest part of the car swinging on the end of the pendulum. Now, this was not some GM secret. Swing axles were everywhere. The Beetle had them, Porsche had them, Mercedes had them, Triumph had them. What made the Corvair different was the fix. Because Chevrolet's engineers knew, and their solution was tire pressure. This is the open loop, those two numbers. The Corvair's recommended cold tire pressures were 15 psi in the front and 26 in the rear. 15 and 26. An 11-pound split, deliberately engineered to undergrip the front end so the car would push before it snapped. Follow that spec, and the Corvair was a stable, predictable, genuinely pleasant car. Ignore it, and every single habit in America in 1962 pushed you toward ignoring it. And you had built yourself a different car entirely. Because a gas station attendant in 1962 doesn't read the door jamb. He puts 24 pounds in all four, the way he does with every car that pulls in, and hands you back your change. And now the front end grips as hard as the back. The balance the engineers designed in has evaporated, and the first time you lift off the throttle mid-corner on a wet on-ramp, the car does something you have never felt an American car do. Meanwhile, and this is the part that is genuinely hard to defend, Chevrolet knew how to fix it mechanically. There was a heavy-duty handling package, sold essentially at cost, that added stiffer springs, a front anti-roll bar, and rear axle rebound straps to limit tuck under. It was not advertised. Salesmen didn't push it. A front anti-roll bar had reportedly been fought over internally and cut to save a few dollars a car. The aftermarket, meanwhile, was happily selling camber compensators to anyone who'd figured it out. And so the lawsuit started. By 1965, there were more than 100 of them. And GM's response was to deny everything and blame the drivers. Chevrolet did fix the car. For 1964, it made the front anti-roll bar standard and added a transverse leaf spring at the rear with softer coils, dramatically reducing jacking. And for 1965, it went further and threw the swing axle out entirely, replacing it with a fully redesigned independent rear suspension derived from Corvette thinking. And the automotive press adored it. Rehook, which means that by the time the book that destroyed the Corvair was published, the car that book described had not been built in over 2 years. In late November 1965, a 31-year-old lawyer named Ralph Nader publishes Unsafe at Any Speed, the designed-in dangers of the American automobile. People remember it as a book about the Corvair. It is not. It has 8 chapters. The Corvair gets 1, the first. And the rest is a broader indictment of an industry that treated safety as an unsellable feature. And at first, it barely moves. It is a dry policy book by an unknown author. What made it a bestseller was not the writing. It was what General Motors did next. The world's most profitable corporation hired a private detective agency to investigate Nader, under the pretense of a routine pre-employment check. agents contacted nearly 60 of his friends and relatives, dug into his politics, his religion, his finances, his grades, his sex life, and Nader alleged that women were sent to lure him into compromising situations. Then they got caught. On March 22, 1966, GM President James Roche sat in front of Senator Abraham Ribicoff's subcommittee on national television and said he was not there to excuse, condone, or justify it in any way, and apologized to the committee and to Nader personally. It was one of the most catastrophic own goals in corporate history. Overnight, an obscure book became a national bestseller, and an unknown lawyer became the most trusted man in America. And the federal agency that would eventually clear the Corvair, the one that wrote that 1972 report, did not exist yet. It was about to be created in that room because of that apology. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act passed the Senate 76-0, and the House 365 to nothing, and President Johnson signed it on September 9, 1966. It created federal vehicle safety standards and the agency that became the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Seatbelts, padded dashboards, collapsible steering columns, crash testing, recalls, the entire architecture of modern automotive safety traces back to that hearing. The Center for Auto Safety has credited the resulting legal changes with helping cut motor vehicle death rates by around 80% and saving millions of lives. In 1970, GM settled Nader's invasion of privacy suit for $425, money he used to fund the consumer movement that would spend the next 30 years auditing corporations like General Motors. And then, 2 years later, that same agency, an agency that owed its existence to the Corvair panic, an agency with every institutional incentive in the world to confirm the story, went and tested the car. Between 1971 and 1972, NHTSA ran a four-front investigation. It combed GM's internal engineering documents, reviewed the public technical literature, examined national accident data, and, through the Texas Transportation Institute at Texas A&M, put a 1963 Corvair through extreme handling maneuvers against a Falcon, a Valiant, a Beetle, a Dauphine, and a second-generation Corvair. The finding, published as Report PB 211-115 and announced by the Department of Transportation that August, the 1960-63 Corvair possessed no greater potential for loss of control in extreme situations than its contemporary competitors. An independent panel of 3 automotive experts reviewed the work, called it adequate in scope and depth, and agreed the Corvair did not have a safety defect and was not more likely to roll over than the cars it was sold against. So the title of this video is Defensible, and here is the fuller version of it. The Corvair was not a uniquely lethal machine. It was an unusual machine, sold to a country that had never learned to drive an unusual machine, by a company that hid the instructions in the fine print. And the second myth dies just as fast, because Ralph Nader did not kill the Corvair either. Look at the production numbers. In 1965, the year the book came out, Chevrolet built roughly 237 00 Corvairs, the model's second best year ever. In 1966, that collapsed to about 104 00. In 1967, it cratered to 27 253, then 15 399, then roughly 6 00, and it was over. But the thing that arrived in April 1964 and sold over 500,000 units in its first year was not a book. It was the Ford Mustang. And the thing that landed in 1967, the year Corvair sales fell by 3/4, was Chevrolet's own Camaro. The Corvair was knocked down by the Mustang and finished off by the Camaro. Nader wrote its obituary. Lee Iacocca pulled the trigger. But I want to be honest with you. Because the version of this story where the Corvair is simply innocent is its own kind of myth. No worse than a Renault Dauphine is not a glowing safety rating. It's a statement that an entire generation of cars handled badly at the limit. Researchers who have gone back through the 1972 report have raised real questions about the test protocol. The cars were loaded to their maximum recommended weight with alignment set at curb weight, a setup that may have masked the abrupt breakaway that drivers and contemporary road testers described. The accident data the report leaned on came from a single state over a 12-month window. And Chevrolet's own behavior remains the loudest evidence against it. You don't quietly engineer a fix, sell it at cost, decline to advertise it, and then make it standard equipment on a car that has nothing wrong with it. So, what actually happened here? The Corvair's real defect was never in the suspension. It was in the assumption that a mass-market car could require an informed, attentive, technically literate driver in a country that sold cars to absolutely everyone. And its real punishment wasn't for being dangerous, it was for what its manufacturer did when it was accused. GM had the engineering data. It had the fix. It had the truth on its side more than it deserved. And it hired detectives instead. The exoneration came in 1972, and nobody heard it, because verdicts are quiet, and hearings are loud, and reputations in this country are not decided by physics. They're decided by whoever is on television when the apology happens. If this changed how you see the Corvair, subscribe, because we do this every week, taking the thing everybody knows and checking whether anybody ever actually looked it up. And that last car, on May 14, 1969, at Willow Run, gold, a Monza coupe, cameras everywhere. General Motors had built 1.8 million of them, and it killed the car 3 years before its own government would rule that there had never been anything wrong with it. The Corvair is the only car in American history to be acquitted after its own funeral.